Hi, today we'll be reading another chapter from Abe Lincoln Gets His Chance by Frances Kavanagh. Chapter 4. Abe took another bite of cornbread and swallowed hard. Don't you like it? Asked Sally anxiously. I know it doesn't taste like the cornbread Mammy used to make. She looked around the room. The furniture was the same as their mother had used, a homemade table and a few three-legged stools. The same bearskin hung before the hole in the wall that was their only door. But Nancy had kept the cabin clean. She had known how to build a fire that didn't smoke. Sally glanced down at her faded linsey-woolsey dress, soiled with soot. The dirt floor felt cold to her bare feet. Her last pair of moccasins had worn out weeks ago. I don't mind the cornbread. At least, not much. Abe finished his piece down to the last crumb. If I seem down in the mouth, Sally, it's just because... He walked over to the fireplace, where he stood with his back to the room. He misses Nancy, said Dennis bluntly, the same as the rest of us. Then Tom has been gone for quite a spell. Sally put her hand on Abe's shoulder. I'm scared. Do you reckon something has happened to Pappy? Isn't he ever coming back? Abe stared into the fire. He was thinking of the wolves and the panthers loose in the woods. There were many dangers for a man riding alone over the rough forest's paths. The boy wanted to say something to comfort Sally, but he had to tell the truth. I don't know. He stopped to listen. Few travelers passed by their cabin in the winter, but he was sure that he had heard a faint noise in the distance. It sounded like the creak of wheels. The noise came again, this time much closer. A man's voice was shouting, Get up! Get up! Maybe it's Pappy! Abe pushed aside the bearskin and rushed outside. Sally and Dennis were right behind him. It is Pappy, Sally cried. But look! Tom Lincoln had left Pigeon Creek on horseback. He was returning in a wagon drawn by 4 horses. He was not alone. A strange woman sat beside him, holding a small boy in her lap. 2 girls, one about Sally's age, the other about 8, stood behind her. The wagon was piled high with furniture, more furniture than the Lincoln children had ever seen. Whoa there! Tom Lincoln pulled at the reins and brought the wagon to a stop before the door. Here we are, Sarah. He jumped down and held out his hand to help the woman. She was very neat-looking, tall and straight, with neat little curls showing at the edge of her brown hood. She said tisk tisk when she saw Tom's children. She stared at their soiled clothing, their matted hair, their faces smudged with soot. Tisk tisk, she said again, and Abe felt hot all over in spite of the cold wind. He dug the toe of his moccasin into the frozen ground. Abe! Sally! Their father said. I've brought you a new mammy. This here is the widow Johnston. That is, she was the widow Johnston. He cleared his throat. She is Mrs. Lincoln now. I've been back to Kentucky to get myself a wife. Howdy! The new Mrs. Lincoln was trying to sound cheerful. She beckoned to the children in the wagon. They jumped down and stood beside her. These here are my young ones, she went on. The big gal is Betsy. The other one is Mathilda. This little shaver is Johnny. Dennis came forward to be introduced, but he had eyes only for Betsy. She gave him a coy look out of her china blue eyes. Tilda smiled shyly at Sally. Both of the Johnston girls wore pretty linsey-woolsey dresses under their shawls and neat moccasins on their feet. Sally, looking down at her own soiled dress and bare toes, wished that she could run away and hide. Abe said howdy, somewhere down inside his stomach. Sarah, Tom's new wife, looked around the littered yard, then at the cabin. It did not even have a window. It did not have a door that would open and shut, only a ragged bearskin flapping in the wind. She had known Tom since he was a boy and had always liked him. Her first husband, Mr. Johnston, had died some time before, and when Tom had returned to Kentucky and asked her to marry him, she had said yes. He had told her that his children needed a mother's care, And he was right. Poor young ones, she thought. Aloud she said, "Well, let's not all stand out here and freeze. Can't we go inside and get warm?" The inside of the cabin seemed almost as cold as the outdoors, and even more untidy. Johnny clung to his mother's skirt and started to cry. He wanted to go back to Kentucky. His sisters peered through the gloom, trying to see in the dim light. Sally was sure that they were looking at her. She sat down hastily and tucked her feet as far back as she could under the stool. Abe stood quite still, watching this strange woman who had come without warning to take his mother's place. She smiled at him. He did not smile back. Slowly she turned and looked around. Her clear gray eyes took in every nook, every crack of the miserable little one-room house. She noticed the dirty bearskins piled on the pole bed in the corner. She saw the pegs in the wall that led to the loft. The fire smoldering in the fireplace gave out more smoke than heat. "The first thing we'd better do," she said, taking off her bonnet, "is to build up that fire. Then we'll get some victuals ready. I reckon everybody will feel better when we've had a bite to eat." From that moment, things began to happen in the Lincoln cabin. Tom went out to the wagon to unhitch the horses. Dennis brought in more firewood. Abe and Matilda started for the spring, swinging the water pail between them. Betsy mixed a fresh batch of cornbread in the iron skillet, and Sally set it on the hearth to bake. Tom came back from the wagon carrying a comb of honey and a slab of bacon, and soon the magic smell of frying bacon filled the air. There were no dishes, but Sally kept large pieces of bark in the cupboard. 8 people sat down at the one little table, but no one seemed to mind that it was crowded. The Lincoln children had almost forgotten how good bacon could taste. Abe ate in silence, his eyes on his plate. Sally seemed to feel much better sitting between her stepsisters. She was soon chattering with them as though they were old friends. Once she called the new Mrs. Lincoln Mama, just as her own daughters did. Dennis sat on the other side of Betsy. He seemed to be enjoying himself most of all. He sopped up his last drop of golden honey on his last piece of cornbread. "I declare," he said, grinning, "we ain't had a meal like this since Nancy died." Abe jumped up at the mention of his mother's name. He was afraid that he was going to cry. He had started for the door when he felt his father's rough hand on his shoulder. "Abe Lincoln, you set right down there and finish your cornbread." Abe looked up at Tom out of frightened gray eyes, but he shook his head. "I can't, Pa." "A nice way to treat your new ma." Tom Lincoln sounded both angry and embarrassed. "You clean up your plate or I'll give you a good hiding." The young Johnstons gasped. Abe could hear Sally whisper, "Please, Abe, do as Pa says." Then he heard another voice. "Let the boy be, Tom." It was Sarah Lincoln speaking. There was something about the way she said it that made Abe decide to come back and sit down. He managed somehow to eat the rest of his cornbread. He looked up and saw that she was smiling at him again. He almost smiled back. Sarah looked relieved. "Abe and I," she said, "are going to have plenty of chance to get acquainted." Well, thanks for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe and hit the notification bell as well. And I can't wait for you to join me in the next chapter. Bye.